Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. It's Friday evening once again. Nice and hot, isn't it? Oh, today was a sapping, an energy sapping kind of day. I was on the road from Lakefield. I did the Jummah talk at Masjid Ansar in Lakefield. It was lovely to be there and to meet the brothers once again. And driving back, even with the AC on full, that heat, because I suppose we are yet to get into summer proper, we're still going to adjust, and it saps at the energy. But it's a beautiful night, absolutely beautiful. You've got to make the best of whatever the weather offers you. I have a long drive on Friday evenings, coming all the way from Lenasia to Sunning Hill here where our studios are, and then going back. And sometimes people tell me, hey, you know what, you drive all by your own, all on your own from Lenasia and back. It must be a bit hectic, a bit difficult. And I said, you know what, it's not ideal, obviously, from a safety perspective, but that aside, I actually look forward to it, because after an entire week, that drive from Lenasia here to the studios and then back again after the program, it gives me an opportunity to kind of clear my mind and just work through issues, because you're just alone in the car. It's just you. There's no traffic, so you're not tense. You're not moving from lane to lane. You're not getting agitated because of what others are doing on the road. It's a clear road. It just gives you an opportunity to unwind. And as I was driving, this thought just struck me. There were a number of issues that were playing on my mind. Some community-related issues pertaining to the country. I mean, they are problems, major, significant problems. But there are so many more things that we have to be grateful for. Subhanallah, glory be to the Almighty. That if you just look at it, the glass is more than half full. From a personal perspective, from a collective perspective. And we just need to, from time to time, think about the bounties that we enjoy, to be a bit more grateful. That said, we've got a very interesting guest with us on the program this evening, Johan van Lochenberg. If you don't know too much about him, you definitely would have heard his name or read it at some point or the other, especially when there was all that reportage going on about the unit within SARS and allegations and counter-allegations. But his track record is more than just SARS. He's a co-author of the book Rogue, Death and Texas, Tobacco Wars. Recently he's written the book Cop Undercover. That's because he worked undercover as a police agent before he went to SARS, where he headed the investigative unit. And these days he gives analysis on organized crime in South Africa. And he's a lawyer by profession. So yeah, I mean, quite an interesting profile. Johan, thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Good evening and welcome to ITV Networks.
Assalamu alaikum, Moulana, and all your viewers.
Wa alaikum salam.
It's an honor for me.
Do you sometimes look back and think, wow, pretty interesting life?
Yes, I do sometimes. Interesting is not quite the word I would describe, use to describe my life, but it's certainly not been boring. I think, the higher hand certainly put some challenges before me in my life thus far.
Sure. Before we get into discussing the issues that we need to discuss this evening in the program, I always like to just get our viewers to learn more about the guest. Tell us a little bit about your early life. What did you start off thinking you were going to do in life? And then what kind of journey did life take you on?
Well, I don't want to give away too much of my latest book that's just come out. I do tell the story of me as a little boy, but in essence, I was quite a good student in primary school and high school, and I enjoyed science a lot, and I participated in a lot of competitions and things. And there was a point in time where I wanted to become an astronaut, and at a later stage I wanted to become a medical doctor, but that's not what life had in mind for me. I grew up in the sort of in the last 2 decades of the apartheid years. I was born in the same year as the moon landing. And I came of age pretty much when the winds of change were blowing very strong in the country. But I was, obviously one of those privileged little white boys who had little to worry about in terms of, basic needs and good education and that sort of thing. And lived a fairly isolated life in that sense, amongst the Afrikaans community in Pretoria. I grew up there. I went to school and I was in boarding school in Pretoria.
So your latest book, Cop Undercover, deals with what you did first, right? Long before you came to SARS, you were an undercover cop. How did that happen?
Quite by chance. After school, I opted to go and do my, in those years, it was called national conscription. I opted to go and do that in the police at the time, and I ended up at the drug squad in Pietermaritzburg. So to an extent that gave me some exposure and tweaked some interest and gave me some experience in terms of investigating organized crime. I then concluded my national conscription, and then I got my first real job working in the roads department in the then provincial administration of the old Natal, now KZN. And later on, I moved back to Pretoria and continued working in the roads department in Pretoria at provincial level. But at the same time, I happened to, due to circumstances that I describe in the book, be in a position to assist the then Goldstone Commission that was investigating different elements of the old apartheid forces that was busy fomenting violence in different parts of the country, even in those days. And I managed to assist them to an extent. And as a consequence, some of the investigators that I had worked with at the time introduced me to a new concept that had been formed just as the Nats handed power over to the Transitional Executive Council that was going to prepare the country for the first democratic elections. And this was a brand new idea that had been formulated at the time as part of those in power who had hoped to quickly turn the old police around from an element of the regime that suppressed people towards something focusing on modern policing. And it was a very small unit, and I happened to go and meet the people, and they put me through a battery of tests and things. And before I knew it, just before the first national democratic elections, I was undercover, busy infiltrating criminal syndicates in Durban.
Now, you've written a number of books, right? Rogue, Death in Texas, The Tobacco Wars. The earliest part of your life, you're only writing about that now. Why is that? Is it because that after the SARS saga, those issues were of more relevance? Or is it that you're in a different phase of your life where you're now kind of reflecting back to that period in your life?
I'd say it's probably a combination of that. Although the book deals that I signed at the time when I commenced together with Adrian Lakay, and we wrote Rogue, our first book. It had always been my intention to, in one way or another, deal with this false propaganda that I had been an apartheid spy at some point for the old regime. And in a sense, we realized that that's a story on its own. And so in that process of, negotiating the different series of books that were to follow, this happened to be the one that was left for now.
Now, the subtitle, if you like, talks about my life in the shadow with drug peddlers, robbers, smugglers. Was it a scary time?
I mean, I had hairy moments in those years, and some of them I describe in the book. But I would say overall, I was in my 20s. Generally speaking, males in their 20s are less risk averse than once you're a little bit older. And so in that sense, perhaps the fear factor wasn't that acute. You kind of think you can survive pretty much everything. And in a sense, there was an element of adventure to that. And there was an element of feeling part of that new euphoria that existed at the time of, contributing towards building this new country of ours. And those were sort of the main drivers for me, I would say. And fear was not up there. But there were moments. I mean, those people that do manage to read the book will read of a few of those, and there were more. Contrary to popular belief, you think a book is thick enough to tell all your stories, but it's not. The original manuscript was over 600,000 words,
Wow.
and that was cut down to just over 90,000 words. So, there might still be another book there.
I must ask this before we move on, Johan. Is it as exciting as it looks like in the movies to be undercover? Is it like, Vincenzo Terranova, wise guy star kind of thing?
No, not at all. Oh, no, not at all. I mean, if it's exciting and if you're having fun, then you're probably not busy. Hard work, it's suddenly drop, into a community and pretend that you have cash in the pocket and live in a mansion and drive a posh car. In my case, because it was a long period, you have to start at the bottom, and most people in organized crime do start at the bottom. So I had to take a taxi, or I had to take the bus. I lived in a small boarding establishment. I had no money, and I shouldn't, at that stage, shouldn't have had money. And over time it progressed, and obviously what they call the legend made me appear richer and more successful and so on as the years went by. But it's it's a very lonely job, lots of isolation stress. You have absolutely no contact with normality. Your relationships with your family is completely cut off. I did not see my family for many years. You miss out on a lot, particularly in my case. Your 20s are still part of your developmental years. All those things that my peers did in their 20s, I did not do. Living the pretense is it becomes the persona that you pretend to be, and you become close to that. But in a certain sense, you
All right, Johan, I think we're gonna just leave it there for now. We're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, we will continue the discussion. All right, welcome back. So we're talking to Johan van Lochenberg. He's the author of books Rogue, Death in Texas, Tobacco Wars, and his most recent one, Cop Undercover. We were talking about that early part of his life when he actually worked undercover as a cop. Many know him as the former head of the SARS investigative unit, and that's what we focus on now. So, Johan, tell us, how did you end up in SARS, from being an undercover cop to SARS?
Yeah, that's kind of where the book ends. But again, without giving too much of it away, I had reached a point in the police service in 1998 where I realized that I had to find a more normal lifestyle and something more mundane, and focus more on what I thought would be my personal life. And I then began to apply for positions at different places, a couple of state departments and also financial institutions and audit firms. And I simultaneously received two offers at the time, one being an offer from the South African Revenue Service that had just joined the old Customs and Excise and Inland Revenue, or the so-called receiver. And I personally had preference to take the other job, which would have allowed me to travel the world and do something that I was more familiar with. Mm-hmm. But I sought some advice from older people and wiser people whose judgment I truly valued at the time, and all of them said to me that the Revenue Service actually sits at the center of the democratic project. It's part of how this country is going to regain its sovereignty, and it's part of how it's going to fund its efforts to make this country a better place for all. So give it a try. And then I actually followed their advice. In my heart, I felt differently, but I listened to these people. And the job that they offered me at the time, I considered a little bit too complicated and high level for what I believed I would be able to cope with. So I did ask the Revenue Service to lower the position and the salary package at the time, which they fortunately were prepared to do. In fact, I had to do it twice. And so I entered the Revenue Service at a sort of entry level civil service grade at the time, and worked in their old offices in the center of Pretoria for a while, in a unit that was then special investigations, which was a combination of their old inspectorate offices. Kind of over the years worked myself up in the ranks. Of course, it did help that I understood Uplang better than most of the inspectors and the customs guys.
Yeah, Uplang. So if I'm not mistaken, that word came onto the tongue of Praveen Gordhan when he was still the head of SARS.
I'm sure I must have told him about it.
Okay, so you're the guy that they're going to come after now, all the Uplang people. Look, I mean, you've clarified a lot of what was, part of the propaganda against that special investigative unit in SARS that you headed. Books have been written. Just this week, I spoke to Anton Harber, and he's written a book now, For the Record, where he's taken a look purely at the performance of media during the Zuma years, and particularly at the performance of the Sunday Times, and specifically in relation to this SARS unit story. Do you feel kind of vindicated that these things are now coming out and you've got the state capture inquiry, or is it more a case of regret in terms of the damage that was caused?
Moulana, it's one of those things that will, I think, remain misunderstood for a very long time to come, partly because the brand is so deep, and it will forever be raised by nefarious characters whenever it suits them for their own nefarious ends. I mean, I've always been clear on the fact that, first of all, the time that this propaganda campaign began in 2014, for some strange reason, I was of this small unit that, at the time comprised of 6 people only. It was a tiny, tiny unit, 6 people. I actually managed 5 units at the time, and some of those units had offices all over the country, in every big city in the country. And that particular unit took less than 5% of my time on a monthly basis. So, in that sense, it was much ado about nothing. But it, as propaganda goes, it began to develop a life of its own. And there were roughly, according to my analysis, 53 key allegations and key themes that was put out in the media over 2 calendar years that besmirched these originally just over 20 people, and by 2009 only 7 people, and then ultimately 6 people, from the most bizarre claims that they had broken into the Forest Town home of former President Jacob Zuma, to listening in on taxpayer communications, to having budgets of hundreds of millions of rands and sophisticated equipment. The list goes on, and all of that's complete nonsense. Over the years, nobody's ever really reflected on, who were these people that worked in that unit, what did they actually do? Because they did very good. And, for me, that's the sad part. I worked with for many years. My children grow up, and the trauma that, that propaganda caused families is just something that's going to be with them for the rest of their lives. And yeah, I'm talking about, children that got involved in self-harm, suicide attempts, and that sort of thing. It was truly shocking. And that trauma remains. I still convene a trauma support group. We're just over 45 people. It's still very, very difficult for people to put it completely behind them.
Does that make you bitter?
So in that sense,
does it make you bitter?
Sorry?
Are you still angry over what happened?
No, there's no anger at all. You would have seen over the years, in fact, since 2015, I've always gone out of my way to try and engage with those people that were proponents to one extent or another, even in the media, of own accord, to see if we could discover collectively what went wrong and how can we alleviate the mess in the way of apologies and perhaps getting some insight. So over the years, there'd always been apologies, and those apologies weren't directed at me. I always asked that they be directed at the institution and the officials there, both past and current, and their families. And there's a whole long list of those.
Are you confident that SARS will?
I believe.
Yeah, I say, are you confident that SARS now will recover and will be able to come back and function at the level that it was functioning at the time, perhaps when you were there? Because we know what happened after that, the downward spiral. When you look at things from outside now, are you confident that SARS is on the mend?
State capture damaged not just the revenue service, state capture damaged the entire government. It also damaged our media, and it damaged corporate South Africa. And ultimately it damaged every single South African. We must we must contextualize state capture on the back of the history of this country of colonialism. So it's a layered onion of a whole lot of systemic issues. In that sense, we must remain hopeful because we have managed to overcome a lot more together, even in trying times. But it's not going to be easy. There's certainly going to be no miracle. But I've always believed, that when we as individuals or as a group or challenges, one of two things will happen. We will either, succumb to it, or we will come out as stronger. And I want to believe that the majority of us, when we are put to the test, will take up that test and come out stronger.
Hopefully indeed. Right, let's take a break. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Johan van Lochenberg. Right, so we're having a conversation with Johan van Lochenberg. He is the former head of the SARS investigative unit. He's also an author of a number of books. He worked in the early part of his life as an undercover police operative. He's also a lawyer by profession. So far, we spoke about the early period of his life, being undercover. We spoke about the SARS issue, the propaganda, the allegations during that period, the state capture years, as some would refer to it. Corruption is an ongoing discussion in South Africa, and understandably and justifiably so. But many South Africans wonder, even if it be a simplistic kind of question that they ask, that why is corruption so rampant in our country? What would we attribute it to? Whilst there is corruption in almost every country in the world, what is unique about the nature of corruption in South Africa? Why is it that we haven't been able to get to grips with it? It's almost like everywhere, at every level. And that's why, notwithstanding a good intention from a president or a government or any political party, it just seems like you can't get to grips with it. It's like a cancer that is spread throughout the body.
Yes, no, that is so. And I empathize with that view and position. Moulana, with most things in life, the answers are never simple. I think something that's fairly unique in our country is the combination of factors that perhaps sometimes we tend to downplay or forget about. The reality of the matter is that this country that we call South Africa has a peculiar history of colonialism, firstly, in terms of different indigenous groupings and the nature of their relationships with each other. And at a certain point in time came the
Right. Johan, can you still hear me? I think we've got a small technical issue there. Johan is with us via Zoom, so we're going to try and get him back. That's Johan van Lochenberg. You must have seen his name in the newspaper. You must have heard it on the news during the Zuma years when they were talking about the rogue unit within SARS, and everyone was taken aback. Hey, what's happening in this unit within the revenue collection service? And like you mentioned earlier on, all this talk about breaking into people's houses and tapping into people's conversations. And it turns out, he says, that it took up only 5% of his time. It was one small unit. He oversaw 5 units at the time. And it was all just fabrications, lies, part of a propaganda that suited the interest of state capture at the time. He's written these books, Rogue, which he co-authored with the former spokesperson for SARS, Adrian Lackey. Then Death and Taxes, Tobacco Wars, Tobacco the tobacco industry is something that we still need to touch on. All these allegations made during the lockdown period about why there was a ban on tobacco and that kind of thing. He's also a lawyer by profession, you know, and I'm interested to know whether he's practiced that profession. I also want to know from him, you know, to what extent is it true that corporate corruption is not as scrutinized as corruption, say, in political circles. That's the allegation or the assumption. Okay, Johan, you're back with us. You were telling us about your understanding of corruption and the nature of it in South Africa and where we should start, because at the moment it seems like there are intentions, that there are plans, but it just can't get implemented. We just can't seem to get a grip on it.
Yeah, I think one must perhaps reflect on aspects of our society that go back very long in time. And I was saying just before my connection let me down there, that, you know, there is a peculiar history to this geographic location that we call South Africa today, that preceded colonialism, that had to do with the manner in which indigenous groupings related to each other. Then came the Dutch and other colonialists, and once gold and diamonds were discovered, came the British. Out of that came the Boer republics, and all these different dynamics between different groupings within our society. Out of that came the apartheid regime that ran this country for almost 50 years in a particular way. And, you know, it left a deep, deep, deep trauma and mark in our society. Now, in 1994, of course, we saw political freedom. And then, you know, now we 26, 27 years later, and we're now in a democratic constitutional framework that we find ourselves in. But, you know, old habits die hard, and, you know, corruption isn't unique to South Africa, but within the context of these elements that I've mentioned to you now. And then, of course, the importation of this concept of state capture, the manner in which multinational companies and corporates started behaving as they became bigger and bigger, even the way in which, as we entered the information age, the manner in which information is spread, the way politics have morphed, and the way in which our leaders behave, all of those different elements I think are contributing factors towards where we find ourselves today, and they are effectively growing pains. And, you know, it's pandemic, it's a virus, corruption is a terrible thing if it gets out of hand, and that's what's happened in this country. It's gotten out of hand. But I'm quite positive that, as I said before, you know, we come from stock that lived under the apartheid crowd, and I mean that was a corrupt government, if ever. So in that sense, you know, I think we'll get through this too, but it's not necessarily going to happen in one lifetime. It's going to take time, and it's really going to call upon each and every one of us to begin to have those uncomfortable conversations and those difficult discussions in a way so that we don't see what happened, for instance, in Senegal today, you know, where because these things are left unsaid and undealt with, they prop up in ways that are perhaps preventable or unnecessary.
There's always this talk, Johan, about corporate corruption. Do you feel that there's merit in the perception, in the allegation that corruption in the corporate sector goes underreported and not as scrutinized? And the more that there's corruption in the corporate sector, the more inequality becomes entrenched, and the more vulnerable we are to corruption at lower levels and in other sectors.
I do think so, Moulana. I think that, you know, there's always been this kind of perception that big companies and big multinationals are squeaky clean because they have big audit firms that look after their books and so on. But well, I mean, if you're looking for a case study of how wrong we were, we only have to look towards South Africa. Whether it's the sort of audit firms and their oversight role, examples like Steinhoff and Gartner and Bain and KPMG, the list goes on. I mean, we must not forget that less than a decade ago, bribes were tax deductible in Europe. And so it was, in Europe, it was an acceptable practice for multinationals to pay corrupt monies in order to generate income, and it was considered a deductible expense in the production of income. I mean, we only have to look, at examples like Rolls-Royce and BAE, and it's perhaps an element of corruption that, we also don't focus on enough, because we get very angry with the civil servants and those state agencies that are, captured or corrupted. But we must never forget that that's a tango, and it takes two to tango. And, on the other side of that corruption sits the businessman who wants to make the money, or the corporate, or the company, I think you've got something there. It's certainly something that's come to the fore during state capture. It's certainly something that served before our parliament this week, in fact. One of our very good civil society bodies, Open Secrets, made a really good in-depth presentation to parliament about beefing up the regulatory framework around auditing companies, precisely to give our regulator that oversees them some teeth and some powers to hold them to account, because that's ultimately what we rely on.
Yeah.
Make sure.
One quick question before we conclude, Johan. The issue of the tobacco wars, you've written an entire book on that. It came under the microscope once again during the lockdown and the ban from the side of government on the sale of tobacco. There were allegations swirling all over the show that certain ministers and perhaps even government were in bed with certain entities, and hence the ban to allow for the illegal trade to flourish and that kind of thing. To what extent is that true, according to your research, your understanding?
Well, in respect of the ban, I've always been clear since day one when the ban was announced that there has been no evidence that suggests that tobacco manufacturers or companies or traders somehow colluded with government or government ministers in order to make this ban happen so that somebody can benefit from it. I think it was an ill-considered ban. I still maintain that. I think we can see now how much the crooks made and organized crime, and it hurt our local manufacturers incredibly. It's completely changed the market dynamic. But at the same time, the phenomenon of tobacco companies trying to edge in on government policy and directing the attention and focus of law enforcement agencies towards their competitors in order to advance themselves commercially or otherwise, is not unique to South Africa. It's worldwide. It's been happening for decades. There's marvelous research on this, and it's not unique in South Africa. But it's a fact. Organized crime, tobacco, because it's big money and quick money, and politics will always somehow, in one way or another, go hand in hand.
It's been interesting, and it's been a fascinating discussion. Johan van Lochenberg, thank you so much for your time.
Shukran. Thank you, Moulana.
Shukran. Have a great evening and a great weekend, and we hope to have you on the program sometime again in the future. All right, time to take our final break. When we come back, we wrap with some gems and pearls of wisdom from Surah Yusuf. Welcome back. So that was an interesting discussion with Johan van Lochenberg, a man who's done some interesting things in his life. The last couple of weeks, I've been utilizing the last segment to share with you a few nuggets, a few gems of wisdom, a few pearls of wisdom from the tafsir of Surah Yusuf, which I conduct during the course of the week. Now, last week, if I remember correctly, we kind of discussed up to the point where the brothers of Yusuf alayhi salam come to Yusuf alayhi salam. They get one camel load of grain per person, because that's the quota, that's how he's rationing it. And after that, they say, well, we've got another brother at home, Binyamin. He says, no, it doesn't work like that. You've got to bring him to get his share. And now that you've mentioned him, if you don't bring him, then it's possible you're lying and I might not give you anything at all. So using that, despite his better judgment, Yaqub alayhi salam is convinced by his sons that to get any grain now, we need to take Binyamin with. And what I discussed last week, Yaqub alayhi salam then told his children, and this is a point I made, and I sent out a clip on social media as well. He said, Ya baniyya la tadkhulu min babin wahid. That, oh my sons, don't all enter from one door. Because the first time around you went, Yusuf alayhi salam gave them royal treatment. So people are already starting to wonder, who are these people? Why is it that the king is giving them such good treatment? Now if you come as a big delegation, 11 brothers, handsome young men, and all through one door, you're going to draw unnecessary attention to yourself. And this is where I discussed the point from last week, al-aynu haqqun, when Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam said the effect of the envious and the evil eye is a reality. Don't draw unnecessary attention to yourself. That which is out of your control, because you've got to live, and to some extent people will see the bounties of Allah that you're enjoying. You read your Ayatul Kursi, your Mu'awwadhatayn, Qul a'udhu bi rabbil falaq, Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas for protection. And in order to ensure that you're not a perpetrator of having of an evil eye having an effect, or an envious eye having an effect on someone else, whenever you admire something in someone else, always say, MashaAllah, Alhamdulillah, bring the name of Allah into the equation to repel the devil. But then Yaqub alayhi salam told them, وَمَا أُغْنِي عَنْكُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ that وَقَالَ يَا بَنِيَّ لَا تَدْخُلُوا مِنْ بَابٍ وَاحِدٍ وَادْخُلُوا مِنْ أَبْوَابٍ مُتَفَرِّقَةٍ that don't enter through one door, enter from different doors. And he said to them after that listen here, it all depends on Allah in the end. You can take precaution, but whether that will safeguard you or not is in the hands of Allah. So the precaution was not to bring unnecessary attention to themselves, and Yaqub alayhi salam wanted them to take all the precaution, but Allah had a different plan. Binyamin was to stay behind, and Yaqub alayhi salam was to be tested to a great extent. And this is a lesson now that we need to think about. Many times you have one huge test in your life and you think, well, that's it now, I've been tested in a big way in life. Not necessarily. Yaqub alayhi salam was tested in a major way. 40 years separated from his beloved Yusuf. Now he was going to be separated from Binyamin and yet another son, as we will discover, in terms of how we go along. Here the scholars have written, very interestingly they say, Yusuf alayhi salam knew who his brothers were, like we discussed previously. They did not know who he was. Notwithstanding that, he asked for them to bring the brother Binyamin, but he never asked for them to bring the father. And logic would dictate that you would want to see your father more than you would want to see your brother. And this is where the Mufassirin write that Yusuf alayhi salam was not acting on his own desire. He was acting on the instruction of Allah. He was a Nabi. Allah wanted to test Yaqub alayhi salam further by separating him from Binyamin as well. Hence, Allah did not allow Yusuf alayhi salam to ask his brothers to bring the father, because the father would have also got a load of grain then. Rather, he said, no, bring your brother. Now, وَلَمَّا دَخَلُوا عَلَى يُوسُفَ آوَى إِلَيْهِ أَخَا قَالَ إِنِّي أَنَا أَخُوكَ. When Binyamin came, Yusuf alayhi salam took him and said, listen, I'm your brother. One mother, one father. The others separate mother, but the same father. Binyamin then started to complain to Yusuf alayhi salam that after, you were removed from the equation, they became very jealous of me because our father became very attached to me. Now, that's the second point I want to share with you this evening, viewers. And that is that when you're a jealous person, your jealousy doesn't come to an end when the person that you are jealous of is removed from the equation. You'll become jealous of someone else. As long as you don't have it all, you'll continue to be jealous. They thought that let's remove Yusuf, we'll make tawbah, but then at least our father's exclusive attention will be for us. Binyamin came into the equation. You see, that's what jealousy does to you. You'll never end. It'll eat you up from inside. It'll eat up all of your good deeds. And even now they were jealous. That why is the king wanting to see Binyamin? So the whole road they were giving him a hard time, taunting him, scolding him, being very difficult with him. And he complained to Yusuf alayhi salam. And Yusuf alayhi salam said, فَلَا تَبْتَئِسْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Don't worry too much. Things are coming to a very interesting point. فَلَمَّا جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ جَعَلَ السِّقَايَةَ فِي رَحْلِ أَخِي ثم أذن مؤذن أيتها العير إنكم لسارقون. When they were leaving, the special cup of the king, which was valuable, which was used to measure the grain, was put in the luggage of Binyamin. The announcer then announced as they had left to say, hey, hold it, there's something missing. قالوا وماذا تفقدون? What's missing? قالوا نفقد السواع الملك. This valuable king, this valuable cup is missing. And then they said, but you know, what do we have to do about this? We have not come to create any mischief here. You can see that. So the announcer said, فَمَا جَزَاؤُهُ إِن كُنْتُمْ كَاذِبِينَ. What should be the crime of the person who has stolen this? And now, the brothers, they then gave an answer according to the Sharia of Yaqub and Ibrahim alayhi salam. In that Sharia, if you were guilty of stealing, you became the slave of the person whose item you stole for 1 year. According to Egyptian law at the time, if you were stealing and you got caught, you'd get corporal punishment and you had to pay the value of the stolen item times 2 to the person whose item you stole. So according to Egyptian law, Yaqub alayhi salam, rather Yusuf alayhi salam would not have been able to keep Binyamin back. But according to the Sharia of Yaqub and Ibrahim alayhi salam, he could have. That's why they posed the question to them that if it is proven that one of you are the thief, what should be the crime? So they gave the answer according to their Sharia. And then the cup was discovered in their luggage, and Binyamin was then kept back for that very reason. And Allah then says, Yusuf alayhi salam did not do anything from his own side. كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا لِيُوسُف. Allah says, we put in place the strategy for Yusuf alayhi salam because Allah has a greater plan. We don't always understand how it works, but Allah has a greater plan. I'll have to leave it there for this week. The next week, inshallah, we'll continue the discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.